For the past 10,000 years, Earth's history has been dominated by one single supervolcano. It erupted in what is now Indonesia and sent ash and rock over 25 miles high into the atmosphere. This is the largest volcanic eruption in the last 26 million years, and it changed our planet forever. But even though this happened not long ago, on the scale of Earth's history, we know relatively little about it. We don't even know what caused it to erupt. So scientists are turning to chemistry to find out, and they have found some pretty interesting things. The reason that we call this the supervolcano is because it blows the others away. In fact, there's only 8 known volcanoes on Earth that have ever qualified for that title. You may have heard of Yellowstone, which might go down in history as one of these if it ever blew up. The defining characteristic of a supervolcano isn't its size, but what happens during the eruption. When a supervolcano erupts, it blows more than 1,000 cubic miles of material out of its mouth, which is enough to cover the entire United States and more than 3 feet of ash. And while the world knows this, exactly how and why these giant eruptions happen is still somewhat of a mystery. Most of the world's supervolcanoes seem to happen at places where tectonic plates meet. For instance, Yellowstone sits atop the North American plate and the Pacific plate, which makes it the perfect place for a volcano. The energy that builds up between those two plates can manifest itself in a lot of ways, but one of those just happens to be pushing magma up toward the surface. But not all supervolcanoes form this way. Some are formed when one plate slides under another, like the so-called subduction zones. The descending plate melts as it reaches extreme temperatures and pressures, forming magma that can pool beneath the new plate. Eventually, there is so much magma that it just pushes through the overriding plate and forms a volcano. The reason this doesn't happen everywhere, that plates touch or slide under each other, is complicated and still not well understood. But we do know that the magma chambers that feed these volcanoes play an important role. When magma builds up inside a volcano, it tends to pool in these huge underground chambers. They can stretch for miles beneath the earth and hold tons of molten rock. But if these chambers are big enough, sometimes something called convection happens. Hot magma near the bottom of the chamber starts to rise, while cooler magma near the top sinks down. As this process continues, it can form giant rotating currents within the magma chamber. Now, it turns out that hot magma isn't always more buoyant than cool magma. If the hot magma is less dense than the cool magma, then the whole thing will stop working. And that's a problem for the formation of a supervolcano. See, in order to get a super eruption, you need a nearly full magma chamber. And if convection happens, that can prevent the magma from getting too buoyant. That's what scientists think happened at one of the world's most famous supervolcanoes, Lake Toba in Indonesia. We know that the world was a very different place after it erupted, because the ash layer left behind in the explosion is present in every layer of rock going back 11,700 years. In other words, there's no escaping the evidence of this eruption. But we have a much harder time understanding what caused it to happen. We don't even know for sure if the eruption was caused by a subduction zone or a plate boundary. But scientists do know that the magma chamber beneath the lake was huge. One team of researchers estimated that it was able to hold as much as 2,800 cubic miles of magma, and the eruption emptied out around half of that chamber. And if convection currents were happening in that chamber, that would allow a much greater volume of magma to build up before it was too buoyant to keep rising. So figuring out whether or not convection currents played a part in the formation of Lake Toba could help us understand how future supervolcanoes form. Unfortunately, this is a pretty hard question to answer. Like we said before, not all hot magma is more buoyant than cool magma. And that means that any evidence of convection in the magma chamber won't leave a physical trace behind. There's nothing to see in the rocks that would give away the game. But luckily, chemistry is here to save the day. As the magma chamber filled up with liquid rock, dissolved gases would start to reach their boiling point. At that point, they'd form bubbles. Just like water boiling in a pot, these bubbles would float toward the top of the chamber and collect. And as they rose, they would dissolve more gas into the magma. Over time, the bubbles would become super saturated with gas. So once they reached the top of the magma chamber, all that gas would come out of solution and form solid crystals. This is a process called bubble wall growth, and it's basically like rain in the magma chamber. These crystals precipitate out of the magma and move toward the top of the chamber, where they stick together and form a kind of crust. But this crust wouldn't just be made of one type of crystal. As the bubbles rise, they would pick up minerals from different parts of the magma chamber. So the top of the bubble wall would end up being a kind of chemical map of the magma chamber. If we can identify what minerals crystallized along the top of this bubble wall, we should be able to figure out what parts of the magma chamber they came from. And if we know what parts of the magma chamber they came from, we can work backward to figure out if convection was happening. But first, we need to get to the bubble walls. Researchers have collected rock samples from Lake Toba and analyzed the mineral content. They identified a mineral called sanidine, which only forms at high temperatures. They also identified apatite, which forms from silica and phosphorus. And finally, they found zircon, which forms from silica and oxygen. Then they compared these minerals to similar igneous rocks that formed under different conditions. For instance, they studied rocks that came from shallow depths where the magma wasn't very hot, and rocks that came from great depths where the magma was hundreds of degrees hotter. Then they looked at other supervolcanic eruptions and saw what kinds of minerals formed in those chambers. And eventually, they figured out that the temperature of the magma chamber at Lake Toba had to be around 954 degrees Fahrenheit. But that's still not enough to tell if convection was happening or not. For that, they needed to study the actual structure of the crystals. In a normal magma chamber, the crystals form evenly as the magma cools. But if convection is happening, the crystals will form faster at the bottom of the chamber and slower at the top. In other words, if there are convection currents, the mineral crystals will be larger at the bottom of the magma chamber and smaller at the top. So they did just that. They looked at thin sections of the rock under a microscope and measured the sizes of the mineral crystals. And they found that the crystals at the bottom of the magma chamber were indeed larger, which meant that convection was definitely happening. Now, we know that part of what caused the Lake Toba supereruption was due to the presence of convection currents beneath the Earth. But we still don't know exactly how they formed or why they stopped working properly and let the eruption happen. There are a lot of unanswered questions about this volcano and many other supervolcanoes. But studying them helps us to better understand the chemistry of our planet and prepare for future eruptions. Speaking of preparation, you might be wondering how you can prepare yourself for the future. How can you make sure that you're ready for anything life throws at you? Well, one way is to learn math. Math is involved in everything we do these days. And the more you know, the more you'll be able to do. Thanks for watching.